what Google has quietly built into every Android smartphone that has ever been released. A hidden setting of such extraordinary practical value, such immediate and tangible impact on the daily experience of using an Android device, and such dramatic effectiveness at eliminating the relentless, intrusive, battery-draining, data-consuming, privacy-violating advertisements that most Android users have simply accepted as an inescapable feature of the modern smartphone experience, without ever knowing that the solution to the problem they have been tolerating for years was sitting quietly inside their device the entire time, accessible to anyone who knows where to look, requiring no subscription fee, no third-party application download, no technical expertise, and no modification of the device that would void its warranty or violate its terms of service, is a setting that the overwhelming majority of the billions of Android users around the world have never discovered, never been told about, never been shown by the carriers who sold them their phones or the manufacturers who built their devices, and never encountered in the endless stream of technology tips, smartphone optimization guides, and Android tutorial content that floods the internet, and that somehow, despite covering every conceivable aspect of Android customization and Android optimization, has consistently failed to bring this specific hidden setting to the mainstream attention of the Android user population that would benefit most dramatically and most immediately from knowing it exists and from taking the 30 seconds required to enable it on their device. The hidden setting in question is the private DNS feature, a capability built directly into the Android operating system since Android 9 Pie that allows Android users to specify a custom DNS resolver that their device will use for all network name resolution, replacing the default DNS resolver provided by their mobile carrier or their Wi-Fi network with a privacy-focused, security-enhanced ad-blocking DNS resolver that intercepts requests for the domains associated with advertising. Networks, tracking services, malware distribution sites, and other categories of unwanted internet content and blocks those requests before they can reach the advertising servers that would otherwise respond to them and deliver the advertisements, the trackers, the analytics scripts, and the other unwanted content that consumes the user's bandwidth, drains the device's battery, slows the device's performance, and enables the comprehensive surveillance of the user's online behavior that the advertising and tracking ecosystem depends upon for its operation. DNS, the domain name system, is the internet's address book, the system that translates the human-readable domain names like google.com or youtube.com that users type into their browsers and that applications reference in their code into the numerical IP addresses that the internet's routing infrastructure actually uses to direct network traffic to the correct servers. A translation that happens invisibly and automatically every time any application on any internet-connected device makes any network request. And that represents a choke point of extraordinary strategic importance in the flow of internet traffic, because every domain name that any application wants to reach must be resolved through DNS before the connection to that domain can be established, meaning that a DNS resolver that is configured to block requests for specific domains can prevent those connections from being established at all, effectively blocking any application's ability to reach the blocked domains regardless of which application is making the request, and regardless of whether the application has any user-visible interface through which blocking could otherwise be implemented. The private DNS feature in Android leverages this DNS choke point to implement system-wide ad and tracker blocking that operates at the operating system level, rather than at the browser level or the application level, meaning that unlike browser-based ad blockers that only block advertisements within the specific browser where the extension is installed and that cannot touch the advertisements displayed. Applications, the private DNS-based blocking that this hidden Android setting enables blocks advertising and tracking domains across every application on the device simultaneously, including the in-app advertisements in games and free applications, the tracking pixels in email clients, the analytics services in social media applications, the advertising networks serving ads in news applications, the behavioral tracking services embedded in shopping applications, and every other source of unwanted advertising and tracking network traffic across the entire device ecosystem, without requiring the user to install any additional software, grant any additional permissions, or take any action beyond the single configuration change in the Android settings that activates the private DNS feature and points it at an ad-blocking DNS resolver. The ad-blocking DNS resolvers that can be configured through Android's private DNS feature, the specific services that implement the domain-level blocking of advertising networks, tracking services, and other unwanted content categories that makes this hidden setting so extraordinarily effective at reducing the advertising load on Android devices, include several free, reputable, and highly effective options that different users may prefer based on their specific priorities and preferences, with the most widely recommended and most extensively tested, including AdGuard DNS, which blocks advertising and tracking domains across an extensively curated block list that is continuously updated to include new advertising networks and tracking services as they emerge. Cloudflare's 1.1.1.1 for families, which combines privacy-focused DNS resolution with blocking of malware and adult content categories in addition to some tracking domains. NextDNS, which provides highly customizable blocking policies that allow users to select specific categories of content to block and to add custom block lists beyond the default blocking configuration. And the Control-D service, which offers extensive customization options, including the ability to block not just advertising and tracking, but social media, streaming services, gambling sites, and other content categories that users may want to restrict on their device. The process of enabling the private DNS feature on an Android device, the specific steps that every Android user should follow right now to activate the hidden setting that blocks all ads and that most people don't know exists, begins with opening the Settings application. On the Android device, navigating to the Network and Internet section or the Connection section, depending on the specific Android version and device manufacturer's interface customization, finding the private DNS option within the network settings, tapping on it to access the private DNS configuration, selecting the private DNS provider hostname option rather than the off or automatic options that most users will find selected by default, entering the host name of the ad-blocking DNS resolver they have chosen to use. For AdGuard DNS, this is dns.adguard.com. For Cloudflare's family-focused resolver, this is family.cloudflaredns.com. For NextDNS, this is a personalized hostname generated during account setup at the NextDNS website, and saving the configuration, after which the device will immediately begin using the specified ad-blocking DNS resolver for all network name resolution. And the blocking of advertising and tracking domains will take effect immediately across every application on the device without requiring a restart or any additional configuration steps. The immediate and dramatic impact of enabling ad-blocking private DNS on an Android device is something that users who have lived with the default advertising-saturated Android experience typically describe as one of the most transformative single changes they have ever made to their device, because the elimination of advertising across every application simultaneously is not a subtle or gradual improvement, but an immediate and comprehensive transformation of the device's interface that removes entire categories of visual noise, eliminates the interruptions to normal application use that intrusive advertisements create, and produces changes in device performance and battery life that are immediately apparent and immediately measurable in the usage statistics that the Android operating system provides for monitoring battery consumption and data usage. The battery life improvement that ad-blocking private DNS produces is one of the most practically significant and most immediately valuable benefits for Android users who have been suffering through the shortened battery endurance that advertising-heavy applications impose, because the advertising networks, the tracking services, and the analytics platforms that are blocked by the private DNS configuration are not simply passive sources of visual advertising content, but active consumers of the device's processing power, network radio and battery energy, making network requests, downloading advertising content, running JavaScript and other code associated with advertising and tracking systems, and communicating with remote servers in ways that consume measurable and sometimes substantial quantities of battery power that the user is paying for with their device's charge cycle without receiving any benefit in return beyond the advertising that they almost certainly do not want to see, and that the private DNS blocking will eliminate entirely. Research conducted by various independent testing organizations and technology publications has documented battery life improvements of between 10 and 30% in some Android devices when system-wide ad blocking is enabled. A range of improvement that depends heavily on the specific applications installed on the device and the advertising intensity of those applications, but that represents a genuinely significant and genuinely valuable enhancement of one of the most practically important aspects of the Android smartphone experience for users who have been accepting shortened battery endurance as an unavoidable feature of using advertising-supported applications without realizing that the advertising that was shortening their battery life was simultaneously addressable through a built-in Android feature they had never discovered. The mobile data consumption reduction that ad-blocking private DNS produces is another immediately quantifiable and immediately valuable benefit, because the advertising content, the tracking pixels, the analytics data, and the other advertising ecosystem traffic that the private DNS blocking eliminates represents a measurable portion of the total data consumption of advertising-heavy applications, a portion whose elimination reduces the monthly mobile data usage of affected devices and extends the effective coverage of the mobile data plan that the user is paying for each month, representing a direct financial benefit from enabling the private DNS feature in addition to the user experience and privacy benefits that the elimination of advertising and tracking provides. The performance improvement, the reduction in application loading times, the smoother scrolling experience in advertising, heavy applications and websites, the faster response to user interactions and applications that were previously spending processing resources on advertising. Content loading and rendering alongside their primary content is another category of benefit that Android users who enable ad blocking private DNS typically report as immediately noticeable and consistently appreciated because the processing resources that advertising content rendering was consuming are freed for the application's primary functions when the advertising content is blocked before it can be downloaded, producing the kind of performance improvement that hardware upgrades typically cost hundreds of dollars to achieve, but that the private DNS configuration change produces for free. The privacy improvement that ad blocking private DNS provides, the reduction in the behavioral tracking, the cross-application surveillance, and the comprehensive personal data collection that the advertising and tracking ecosystem conducts through the tracking pixels, the analytics services, the advertising network identifiers, and the behavioral profiling systems that the private DNS blocking eliminates across every application on the device, is perhaps the most fundamentally important benefit of this hidden Android setting from the perspective of the user's long-term digital rights, personal autonomy, and freedom from the kind of comprehensive commercial surveillance that the modern advertising ecosystem conducts against smartphone users without their meaningful knowledge or their genuine informed consent. The advertising and tracking ecosystem that operates across Android applications, the network of advertising platforms, data brokers, behavioral analytics services, cross-device tracking systems, and personal data monetization infrastructure that has been built into the fabric of the Android application ecosystem. And that processes the behavioral data of Android users at a scale and with a comprehensiveness that most users would find deeply alarming if they fully understood its scope. Depends on the ability to make network requests to its servers from within the applications on the user's device, requests that the private DNS blocking intercepts and blocks before they can reach the advertising and tracking servers that would otherwise receive and process the user's behavioral data, effectively cutting the data pipeline that feeds the advertising ecosystem and protecting the user's behavioral data from the commercial surveillance that the advertising ecosystem depends upon for its operation. The compatibility of ad blocking private DNS with the normal operation of legitimate applications, the question of whether the domain level blocking implemented through the private DNS feature will interfere with the core functionality of legitimate applications by blocking domains that those applications need to reach to function correctly, is a question that the design and the implementation of reputable ad blocking DNS resolvers like AdGuard DNS and NextDNS addresses through the careful curation of their block lists to exclude the domains that legitimate applications use for their core functionality and to block only the domains that serve advertising and tracking functions. Without serving any legitimate application functionality, a distinction that the developers of these services maintain through continuous monitoring, user feedback, and the addition of whitelist exceptions for domains that are incorrectly blocked in ways that affect legitimate application functionality. Some users may find that specific applications or specific application features do not function correctly after enabling ad blocking private DNS due to the blocking of domains that those applications depend upon for functionality that the blocklist designers did not anticipate or did not correctly classify as legitimate functionality rather than advertising or tracking functionality, a situation that can typically be resolved by identifying the specific domain that is being blocked and adding it to the whitelist configuration of the DNS service being used, a process that is most straightforward with customizable services like NextDNS that provide user-accessible whitelist configuration, but that may require switching to a different ad blocking DNS service if the blocking of necessary domains cannot be resolved through the available configuration options. The comparison between private DNS ad blocking and browser-based ad blocking extensions, the ad blocking tools that most Android users who have attempted to address the advertising problem are already familiar with from their desktop or laptop computer experience that are available for some Android browsers, illustrates the specific advantage of the private DNS approach that makes it superior for most Android users, despite the greater configurability and the greater blocking sophistication that some browser-based ad blocking extensions provide, because the system-wide nature of the private DNS blocking that covers every application rather than just the browser where the extension is installed addresses the most practically significant source of unwanted advertising that Android users encounter in their daily device use, which is the in-application advertising in games, social media applications, news applications, and other non-browser applications that browser-based ad blocking extensions cannot touch regardless of how effectively they block advertising within the browser. The relationship between private DNS ad blocking and VPN-based ad blocking applications, the dedicated ad blocking applications available on the Android platform that implement their blocking through a local VPN connection that routes all device traffic through an ad blocking filter is a relationship that helps clarify the specific advantages and the specific limitations of each approach, with the private DNS approach offering the advantages of zero additional battery consumption from the VPN overhead that local VPN-based blockers impose, no conflict with actual VPN services that the user might want to use for privacy or security purposes, simpler configuration that requires no additional application installation, and system-level integration that makes it impossible for applications to bypass through the methods that some applications use to circumvent VPN-based blocking, while the VPN-based approach offers the advantages of more sophisticated blocking that goes beyond DNS-level domain blocking to implement content-level blocking within network responses, the ability to use the blocking service while also routing traffic through a specific VPN server for privacy or geographic unblocking purposes through split tunneling configurations, and greater visibility into the specific blocking activity through the dashboard and reporting interfaces that most VPN-based blocking applications provide. The additional security benefit of private DNS, beyond the ad and tracker blocking that is its primary appeal for most users, derives from the ability of reputable private DNS services to implement blocking of malware distribution domains, phishing sites, and other malicious internet infrastructure in addition to advertising and tracking domains, providing a layer of protection against the device being directed to malicious destinations through the same DNS-level blocking mechanism that prevents advertising domains from being reached, making the private DNS configuration a security enhancement as well as an ad blocking enhancement for Android devices, whose users enable it and whose DNS service provider implements the malware and phishing domain blocking that the best available services include as a standard component of their service. The data about how comprehensively this hidden Android setting blocks advertising across the applications and the use cases that Android users encounter in their normal device uses data that independent testers, who have evaluated the effectiveness of private DNS-based ad blocking, have found to be impressive across most, but not all, categories of advertising, with the highest blocking effectiveness achieved against the network request-based advertising that constitutes the majority of mobile advertising and that is blocked with very high reliability through domain-level DNS blocking, and somewhat lower effectiveness against the server-side advertising insertion techniques that some streaming services and some application developers use to deliver advertising through the same domains that serve their legitimate content, making DNS-level blocking insufficient to catch the advertising that is served through domain names that must be allowed for the primary application function to work correctly. Despite this limitation in its effectiveness against server-side advertising insertion, the ad-blocking private DNS feature remains by far the most impactful and most broadly effective ad-blocking tool available to the majority of Android users for the most common categories of advertising they encounter across their most commonly used applications. And its activation through the simple and reversible configuration change in Android settings represents the single most valuable and most immediately impactful improvement that most Android users can make to their device's performance, their battery life, their data consumption, their privacy protection, and their overall daily experience of using an Android smartphone that was designed with this capability built in but never told most of its users that it was there. Turn this setting on today. Open your Android settings, navigate to the private DNS configuration, enter the host name of the ad, blocking DNS service you want to use, save the configuration, and experience immediately the dramatic difference that system-wide ad blocking makes to the experience of using an Android device that was always capable of operating without the relentless, intrusive, battery-draining advertising that most Android users have been tolerating as an unavoidable feature of their smartphone experience, without ever knowing that the solution to the problem had been sitting quietly inside their device the entire time, waiting for someone to tell them where to find it and how to turn it on. Like this. Video. If this complete, detailed, and genuinely valuable discovery of the hidden Android setting that blocks all ads and that most people don't know exists gave you the specific knowledge and the practical guidance you need to immediately improve your Android experience in ways that are free, immediate, reversible, and more impactful than almost any other single change you could make to your device's configuration. Subscribe to this channel for the kind of practically valuable, genuinely useful, and consistently surprising Android optimization and privacy content that the Android user community deserves to have access to without needing to stumble across it by accident or dig through obscure technical documentation to find it, and tell me in the comments which ad-blocking DNS service you chose to configure in your Android private DNS settings. and how dramatic the improvement to your device's advertising situation was immediately after enabling the hidden setting that blocks all ads, and that most people, until now, simply did not know existed on their Android phone. See you in the next one.